At its peak, over 750,000 licensed ham radio operators filled the airwaves from garages and backyard antenna towers across America. A global brotherhood connected by nothing but electromagnetic waves. That sounded like a community built to last. At least that's what everyone thought. Today, the average operator is between 63 and 68 years old. Less than 10% are under 40. And every year, the silence on the bands grows a little louder. The story of ham radio begins at the turn of the 20th century in an electromagnetic landscape that looked nothing like what we know today. After Guglielmo Marconi proved that radio signals could cross the Atlantic Ocean in 1901, a wave of curiosity swept through workshops and basements throughout the country. People started building their own crude wireless sets from published instructions, using devices called spark gap transmitters. Many of these earliest experimenters were former commercial telegraphers who had migrated from landline offices to coastal wireless stations, bringing with them the codes and culture of their old trade. Terms like CQ for calling all stations and 73 as a sign-off greeting came straight from the telegraph era, and ham operators still use them today. These early rigs were simple, cheap, and wildly disruptive. Every transmission blasted across huge swaths of the radio spectrum, slamming into commercial shipping signals, government communications, and other amateur stations all at once. Professional telegraphers hated it. They started calling these clumsy hobbyists hams, a derogatory slang term for someone with heavy-handed, incompetent Morse code technique. It was meant as an insult, but the amateurs did not care. They took the name, wore it proudly, and turned it into an identity that endures to this day. For a while, the chaos on the airwaves was manageable. But by 1912, the electromagnetic spectrum had become a war zone between military stations, maritime operators, and a rapidly growing swarm of private hobbyists all fighting for the same frequencies. The sinking of the Titanic that April exposed just how dangerous uncoordinated radio traffic could be when lives depended on clear communication. Distress signals were delayed. Rescue coordination was hampered. The disaster made it brutally obvious that the airwaves needed rules. Congress responded with the Radio Act of 1912, the first federal law to regulate the electromagnetic spectrum. It required all operators to pass a test and obtain a license. And then it delivered the real blow. Amateurs were permanently banned from the primary commercial and military wavelengths and exiled to frequencies above 1.5 megahertz, a range that every professional engineer in America considered useless for long-range communication. The hobby collapsed. Participation dropped by an estimated 88% almost overnight. I mean, think about that for a second. Nearly 9 out of 10 operators just walked away. But the ones who stayed did something no one expected. Confined to those supposedly worthless frequencies, they experimented relentlessly. Within a decade, amateur operators discovered the phenomenon of ionospheric skip, proving that shortwave signals could bounce off the upper atmosphere and travel thousands of miles. The frequencies the government had dismissed as garbage turned out to be the most powerful long-range communication tool on the planet. In 1914, an inventor named Hiram Percy Maxim realized that messages could be systematically passed over vast distances if relay stations were properly organized. He founded the American Radio Relay League, an organization that rapidly became the institutional backbone of the amateur community. And no, I am not making that up. Over a century later, the ARRL is still running. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The government wasn't done interfering with ham radio. Not even close. When America entered World War I in 1917, Congress ordered every amateur operator in the country to immediately stop transmitting and physically dismantle their equipment. The ban was total. The airwaves went silent. After the war ended, the Navy refused to give the frequencies back, insisting that wireless communications were too strategically valuable to return to civilian hobbyists. It took years of aggressive lobbying by amateur organizations to finally restore operations in October 1919. If the hobby had stopped here, this would be a very different story. But 20 years later, history repeated itself almost exactly. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the FCC issued Order Number 87, pulling every amateur frequency off the air for national defense. Operators powered down their transmitters. Many had their equipment confiscated outright or repurposed for immediate military use. In occupied territories overseas, some operators ran secret clandestine stations for resistance movements, relaying critical intelligence to Allied forces while knowing that detection by enemy radio direction finding units meant execution. And yet the military simultaneously realized that ham operators were an extraordinary asset. These were civilians who already knew shortwave propagation, Morse code, and radio maintenance inside and out. Thousands were recruited or drafted into the Army Signal Corps, serving as combat radio operators and field technicians in every theater of the war. By 1942, the FCC created a limited exception called the War Emergency Radio Service, allowing certain licensed hams to operate on restricted frequencies strictly for civil defense and air raid coordination. The government spent years silencing these people, then discovered it could not fight a global war without them. And if you are wondering how that contradiction ever got resolved, so is everyone else. When the war ended in 1945, amateur radio exploded into its golden age. Returning veterans brought formal electronics training from the military. The surplus market flooded with cheap, high-quality radio equipment like the ARC-5 transmitter sets, which could be modified for amateur frequencies in an afternoon. Ham radio clubs opened in cities and small towns in every state. Licensing numbers climbed year after year. Emergency communication networks grew more organized, more capable, and more deeply woven into the fabric of American infrastructure. Through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, everything seemed fine. The clock was already ticking. The hobby just could not hear it yet. Up to this point, ham radio had always bounced back from every setback thrown at it. That was about to change. The demographic data from the FCC's active license database in 2024 and 2025 tells a sobering story. The average amateur radio operator in America is now firmly in their 60s. Entry-level technician class licensees average 58 years old. General class operators average 66. The highest tier, amateur extra, averages 67. The hobby's most experienced, most dedicated core is aging out, and the pipeline behind them is nearly empty. The geographic data makes the picture even more uneven. States like Idaho and Utah lead the nation with 1,160 operators per 100,000 residents, concentrated in rural western communities where self-reliance culture still runs deep. Meanwhile, New York sits at just 300 per 100,000, and Washington, D.C. records only 174. And this is not just an American problem. Japan lost over 600,000 licensed operators in the past 2 decades alone. In 2022, the FCC introduced a mandatory $35 processing fee on all new license applications and renewals, adding a financial barrier to a system that had been free for years. If the baby boomer generation, which currently dominates organizations like the ARRL, ages out without a corresponding wave of younger operators behind them, the entire social infrastructure of the hobby degrades. The mentorship networks, the emergency response readiness, the accumulated technical knowledge passed down in local clubs and weekend field exercises, all of it erodes. By 2017, ham radio's high-frequency bands were already suffering. Solar activity had cratered to its 11-year minimum, and traditional voice communications were severely degraded. Then a digital protocol called FT8 changed everything. Developed by Nobel laureate astrophysicist Joe Taylor and engineer Steve Franke, FT8 uses advanced signal processing to decode transmissions buried below the atmospheric noise floor, signals entirely inaudible to the human ear. A single FT8 signal occupies just 50 Hz of bandwidth and operates in rigid 15-second cycles synchronized globally by atomic clocks. Operators with modest antennas and just 50 watts of power were suddenly making reliable contacts across oceans. In late 2024, all of that got put to the test. When Hurricane Helene tore through western North Carolina and parts of Tennessee in late 2024, it destroyed cell towers, collapsed power grids, and severed fiber optic lines. Entire towns were cut off by floodwaters and mudslides, and standard 911 systems went completely dark. Amateur radio operators filled the void, establishing emergency networks from independently powered mountaintop repeaters like the one on Mount Mitchell, and organizing high-frequency emergency nets on 3.923 MHz. For several critical days, ham radio was the only functioning long-distance communication system in the region. Operators routed thousands of welfare messages for stranded families and coordinated medical evacuations when nothing else worked. FCC records showed a measurable nationwide spike in new license applications immediately after, particularly in North Carolina and Florida. The story of ham radio isn't unique. It's the story of every analog community built by one generation and inherited by none. The infrastructure remains. The frequencies are still allocated. The emergency value is proven over and over again, every time a hurricane flattens a cell tower or a wildfire burns through a power grid. But the people who know how to use it, who built it with their own hands and kept it running through wars, through government bans, through decades of quiet dedication in basement workshops and on frozen mountaintops, are disappearing. And no protocol, no matter how advanced, can replace the people who knew how to keep the signal alive.